I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about an instant bestseller on the New York Times list, we have with us my great friend, David Sanger of the New York Times, to talk about his new book, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. David, this book is actually so timely and so readable. What put you onto this? Your last couple books have been more about cyber and things like that.
Well, first, thanks for having me on, and it's great to be back with you, Andrew. And we've talked about a lot of books and a lot of other things in between over the years. This book is different, but a successor to The Perfect Weapon, which was the book about the rise of cyber war. Look, my job for the Times is to cover the White House, cover national security, and basically to cover grand strategy, right? And the thing that struck me the most in what I guess this year is 30 years in Washington is that when I arrived here, fresh back as a foreign correspondent, there was a built-in assumption that the U.S. was a sole unipower, that Russia and China, each for their own very distinct reasons, would sign up to the Western experiments, the Western institutions, the Western norms, that both of them would be driven to re-enter the world economy, and as a result, wouldn't think it's worth it to get involved in territorial disputes, whether it was Ukraine or Taiwan or the South China Sea, that the profit motive would drive them more, and that a world that was moving toward democratization, liberal democracies, the end of history had been just published just a few years before by Francis Fukuyama, but he was hardly the only one signing up to that. So now you look, as I approach 30 years in D.C., and every one of those assumptions turned out to be wrong. And in a more fundamental sense, this was both the greatest intelligence failure of the past 3 decades, not Iraq WMD, and not the state of the Iranian nuclear program, and not even the effects of the internet. But it was also, I think, the greatest example of national wishful thinking, that somehow or another, while we went off and spent 20 years fighting our wars against terrorism, that the rest of the world was sort of going to sit back and sign up on our system. And when we finally woke up from the end of those wars and terrorism, the United States belatedly, a little bit under the Obama administration, more under the national security strategy that H.R. McMaster drafted for Trump, even if Trump didn't read it, and certainly under the Biden administration, have tried to reorient the ship to go deal with a new era of superpower conflict that is in many ways much more complicated and much more dangerous than the old one. The title of this book is not New Cold War, it is New Cold Wars with an S. And that was quite deliberate, because what we are involved in now is a two-front, at very best, confrontation in which Russia and China are episodically joining forces with countries like Iran and so forth. And, one way I was just putting this to somebody the other day as I was going around the country talking about the book, in 2015, when I covered the Iran nuclear talks, the Russians and the Chinese sat on the American and European side of the table. Imagine for a moment that we could get those talks going again. Not likely, but imagine for a moment that we did. They wouldn't be on that same side.
Different side of the table, to be sure.
Yeah.
Well, and some of the body language, we're talking on Friday, April 26th, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is in China, met with Xi Jinping. The body language coming from their meeting wasn't particularly good, was it?
The body language coming out of that meeting seemed to be hedging on both sides. Secretary Blinken came. I haven't seen the full readouts or had a chance to talk to our reporters who were on the trip, so this is preliminary. But they come at a moment when the relationship is stable, but I think it's kind of a false stability that comes from the fact that China's economy has slowed down. Xi Jinping was quite worried when he met President Biden in Riverside, California, for the summit last Thanksgiving, that American and European investors were fleeing China. He knew that they had overstepped and needed to bring those folks back. That's going to take a while. And so I think what happened here was that they had some areas that they thought they could push ahead in. Fentanyl, these fascinating talks taking place about regulating artificial intelligence, all that. But very little progress on the big issues that have been dividing us and that are the subject of the book, including the American export controls on semiconductor equipment and high-end semiconductors that the U.S. has placed on China, and which the Chinese view as a new form of containment, including the Chinese buildup of nuclear weapons, including the South China Sea and the Scarborough Shoal and the confrontations with the Philippines and so forth.
I want to get to all that in a minute, but first I want to ask you, in your book, you mentioned that when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met, they came up with this term, no limits. There's no limits to the partnership.
A partnership with no limits.
A partnership with no limits. What does that exactly mean for the United States?
Well, we don't know yet, and people have been struggling with what it was. You'll remember this meeting took place just days before the opening of the Olympics. And
the Winter Olympics.
It's been the Beijing Olympics, right. And it was unusual because both men had been tucked away because of COVID. Nobody had met them. While we were focused on other things, they had met more than 40 times, interestingly. So they had developed a real relationship. And there was this amazing moment when they signed this long agreement and said they had this partnership with no limits that nobody understood. For a while, it was sort of dismissed in Washington as, yeah, at various moments, the Chinese and the Russians have talked about this mostly to get under our skin. But then I sat through a briefing, an on-the-record briefing that Colin Kahl gave, who is, of course, or was the number 3 in the Pentagon. Stanford scholar, very solid policy person. And he said to a bunch of reporters in a briefing, don't dismiss this. This is for real. There's something coming together here. It's not a real alliance, but it's nothing we can ignore either. And it is essentially, of course, exactly what Kissinger and Nixon were trying to avoid when they did the opening to China. The next day, I happened to be sitting in the chair for the Times at a Joe Biden press conference. I think it was in the East Room or the White House dining room. And he called on me for the last question. And since this was still ringing in my ears, I asked him whether he thought this was for real. And he kind of dismissed it. Now, I don't think he would take that view today. But I thought it was interesting that even within the administration, the president and the number 3 at the Pentagon had very different views of this, or at least that was how they expressed it. President didn't know what Colin had said. Colin, of course, couldn't have known at that time what the president would say, but I still think that was sort of a really interesting moment. I think the administration has now consolidated more around Colin Kahl's view, but I will say this, that it's going to affect every single major decision we make, including whether or not we have the right number of nuclear weapons and we have them deployed in the right ways. So it's going to keep CSIS busy for a long time.
Well, there's no doubt about that. When we think about these new Cold Wars, we often think about dangers. We think about Taiwan. We think about the South China Sea, any number of Iran, any number of issues. What stands out to you as the real flashpoints?
So in the old Cold War, we had no dependency on our main rival, the Soviet Union. I mean, you did, but that was just for caviar and vodka. Okay. The rest of us,
I couldn't afford it back then, though. I couldn't afford it.
And it's sanctioned today, right? So, what can you do?
Yeah.
So in the new Cold Wars, we have huge mutual dependencies with the Chinese. I mean, it's interesting that Xi's biggest complaint to Biden was about getting the ASML machines from the Netherlands that they need to make 3 nanometer chips. And the list goes on. And we need, obviously, much from them. The old think was in the sort of globalization days that this mutual dependency is what avoids all conflict, right? That nobody could go afford to do this. But if you believe that logic, then you believe that Vladimir Putin would never invade Ukraine and put up with sanctions on his one major source of revenue, oil and gas, though he seems to have recovered nicely. If you believed in that theory, then it wouldn't make sense for Xi to threaten that he's going to go deal with Taiwan before he leaves office and that the military has to be ready to go do it by 2027. That doesn't mean they would do it on 2027, but he wants them capable of it. So we're in one of those moments, as we were prior to World War I, where we're discovering that our old model is not actually a great restraint. So I went out, this is a book of reporting, and I not just sit around the office thinking and research. And so I went out of my way to spend a fair bit of time in Taiwan. And I wanted to answer the question, is there really a silicon shield? And my great researcher and co-writer Mary Brooks and I spent a lot of time with Mark Liu, the chairman of Taiwan Semiconductor. And we tried to go get at that question. And I guess the bottom line I left with, Andrew, was the silicon shield is being degraded layer by layer, slowly, as China builds up its own capability. That we're doing the right thing, and I commend Biden for it, by trying to build as much semiconductor capacity inside the United States as we can. Just yesterday, he was in upstate New York announcing a Micron semiconductor facility that the U.S. is helping to fund. But we're not doing it at the pace we need to be doing it if you're really going to go attack this problem. And the Chinese are, and it takes us way too long to go build these facilities. The Japanese are building them much faster. And obviously in Taiwan, new TSMC facilities are being built even while we're adding here in the United States. So our dependency, by the most optimistic projection of the Biden administration, is still going to be something in the order of 80% dependency on Taiwan and China for the more advanced chips by 2030. I'm not sure that's a sustainable number.
So it seems like, we've got some issues, but when you look at the other side, when you look at China, when you look at Russia, Xi Jinping is 71 years old. He's undoubtedly going to be leader until he's 81 years old and beyond. And the people in China, the dark joke going around China is, we used to think that our past was North Korea, but now we think North Korea is our future. Russia, bogged down in Ukraine with no foreseeable exit ramp. What's the outlook, according to your reporting, for both of them?
So they're not 10 feet tall, but let's take them in order. For China, this downturn is significant, and I think it is structural as well as cyclical. And it'll be a good number of years before they pull out of it. But that doesn't mean that they're going to use that time to basically make nice with us. I think that it's at moments when you're under strain that you tend to be more sensitive to the idea that your adversary is constraining you or seeking to contain your power. For Russia, I think they're waiting for the election. If Trump gets elected, they're hoping this game is over, right? We don't really need to go worry about it. That they would be able to fairly quickly come to an agreement with Trump about how to carve up Ukraine.
They really think that Trump's election will solve the problem?
He has said, I will solve this problem in 24 hours. Now, he may not be right about that. And the only way I can think of to solve it in 24 hours is to sit down with the Russians and say, this, and this that you've taken are yours. This, and this is what the Ukrainians are going to have to live with. And we're going to tell them if they want continued American aid, that's going to have to be the deal. And if I was Vladimir Putin and I thought, well, the election's only 6 months away, well, what the hell? Let's give that a shot, right? Even if that isn't the case, I think he's going to take a few years to go rebuild his military after the big mistakes that were made in the first months. They're going to analyze, as we are analyzing, and I had an excerpt from the book on this topic in the Times a few days ago, what technologies the Americans are rolling out that were useful and which ones the Russians were countering. The Russians were terrible at countering missiles and drones in the first year and a half, but they've caught on. And they're now even suppressing some of the HIMARS fire along with many of the drones. The U.S. rolled out American-made drones last year and unleashed those, or the Ukrainians unleashed those on Russia. The Russians took every one of them out. So we've got a few lessons to go learn along the way here. We've had other technologies that have been much more successful. But we've had a few that sounded great on the Pentagon drawing boards, and when you got them up in the air, they turned out not to perform.
So what's the outlook if Biden's reelected and this slogs on in Ukraine? We continue to have to help Ukraine financially, which, we just got a deal done, but it wasn't without any pain up on Capitol Hill.
And it may have come way too late. We don't know. I mean, the question is, if you now move in what Secretary Austin was announcing as another $6 billion or 10% of this right away, that's an effort to try to keep them in the game. That's very different objective than what we were hearing a year ago as they were preparing for the famous counteroffensive that never happened.
And now they're literally out of ammunition.
So that problem should be solved in the next few months. But having the ammunition and having an initiative and plan to go take back territory is a different thing. I mean, what they're really trying to get to is a position where they're in a good enough negotiating position that they would be able to, over time, be able to negotiate a real deal or something Korea-like. In other words, you have a ceasefire, you agree to set up some mechanism to resolve the territorial dispute, which in Korea, we've been going on now since 1953 and not yet resolved that. But an uneasy peace has been retained with occasional violations, but no major war.
In one of your previous books, you wrote that Pakistan was the most dangerous place on earth. What's the most dangerous place on earth right now when you think about it?
Well, Pakistan's still high on the list because they have nuclear weapons we rarely think about, and we don't understand in their current turmoil what the command and control structure is like. But I would say that the most consequential, non-immediate catastrophic concern is the combination of Russia, China, Iran, bit of North Korea, and others who they are trying to gather in their orbit along the way. And that is creating a bit of a new Iron Curtain. Some of it is solid along the Ukraine-Russian border. Some of it is digital as people try to live in both arenas. And then you've got this group of countries that say, as a Singaporean diplomat said to me, it's the title of a chapter, don't make us choose. In other words, let us live in the seam between the two of you. What the old non-aligned movement tried to do in the old Cold War. But in a world of technological competition, as Gina Raimondo put it so well when Microsoft did its investment in G42 the other day, a UAE AI firm. When it comes to cutting edge technology, you can't be in both the American camp and the Chinese camp. You have to choose.
And the choice is pretty clear. We're the higher tech people.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. If the Chinese come along with a Huawei system to wire you up for 5G, and we say, well, we don't have one exactly, but we can send you to Nokia and some others, and they'll piece something together with Ericsson, even though the two of them don't exactly get along. And don't worry, in the next round, we'll have something better for you. You might stick with Huawei.
So let me just ask you, David, here in Washington, policymakers are grappling with these issues. And one of the few bipartisan values out there or viewpoints is that neither party likes China very much. Russia's a different story. What should policymakers do when considering the analysis in your book?
Well, the first thing is pick your fights right. Think about what's important versus what's not important, right? Doesn't strike me that banning Chinese graduate students from coming in a significant way makes a lot of sense. I understand that there's a concern about the theft of intellectual property. That's always been the case. The Chinese don't need people here to steal our intellectual property. They did a really fine job of it by cyber means when they went into OPM and took 22.5 million national security clearance files and so forth. So making sure that we have enough of an interaction, I think, is pretty critical. And just saying we're going to bar Chinese makes no sense to me. Saying that we would bar TikTok strikes me as politically impossible. There are 170 million people who've got TikTok on their phones. How's it going to be, Andrew, when you go home and say to your kids, oh, by the way, kids, this is our erase TikTok from your phones day? How's that going to go over?
Not going to go over well, but how's it going to go over when you try to go tell some of these members of Congress and the president himself you can't campaign on it anymore?
Yeah, it's going to be pretty hard.
Right.
So, and, I love the fact that they want to, on the one hand, ban it, on the other hand, the Biden campaign's using TikTok. The New York Times has had editorials about limiting TikTok, and yet, of course, there's a New York Times TikTok channel, right? So, I mean, the fact of the matter is we're all living in this world where there's the world that we envision we should be in, and there's a world we have to go live in, right?
I'm still waiting for the David Sanger dance on the New York Times TikTok feed.
Closest you're going to get is sparring with Jon Stewart the other day over the book. That was it's about as close as you're going to get. You're not going to see me dancing. So we've got to pick our fights right. I think the semiconductor one is the right one because it gets to a fundamental technology, but it's only the right one if we use the time effectively. And what I worry about is our members of Congress still have a hard time differentiating between what's clearly a national security purchase and what's spending money on something that they view as dual use. So let me give you an example. Do you know, Andrew, what the last aircraft carrier we built was?
No, I don't.
It was the Gerald R. Ford, and it cost about, with all the usual cost overruns, about $15 billion. Today, let's assume that would be 20. Okay, inflation's nasty when it comes to building weapon systems. If we went to Congress today and said the Chinese are expanding their naval fleet dramatically, which they are, and we need 10 more aircraft carriers, which I think would not be the best idea about how to go spend our defense dollars since they're sitting ducks, but just say it, I think you'd probably get it through. And I had this conversation with more than one member of Congress. But if you went to them and said, we need 10 new semiconductor fabs to produce the most high-end semiconductors because the Chinese are investing in it and trying to replicate this, and that the CHIPS Act didn't go far enough. It allocated $52 billion, but that's really got to be $250 billion because we need 10 new ones. And they, too, are $15, $20 billion a pop. I think you'd hear people screaming, that's industrial policy. And then you have to ask your question, if the high-end semiconductors are what you need to let NVIDIA keep us out ahead in building the hardware for large language models and the processing involved, or that's what we need because the high-end semiconductors allow the most high-end weapon systems, I don't fully understand the industrial policy argument.
Against it.
Against it.
Right. Well, where is it coming from?
It's coming from a natural reaction that governments do a terrible job of picking technologies, and sometimes they do. But we also have to do a terrible job of anticipating the weapon systems you're going to need for the next war. Right? That's why we're building Vietnam-era stuff for a world that may be dominated by cyber conflict, right?
Well, I think back to the conversation you had with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, in the book, where he said Ukraine is fighting three wars. It's fighting 1914, it's fighting 1941, and it's fighting now.
That's right. That's right. He said we went into this thinking it would be a clean cyber war. Then we thought it was going to be a World War II era tank war. And then we discovered it was taking place in the form of trench warfare.
A new Cold War, or wars, indeed. David, the book is called New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. Thanks so much for spending some time today. Great book, as always, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Great to be with you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.